He put $300 on my kitchen table like he was leaving a tip. 4 20s, a 10, a stack of 5s folded in half, and someone's on top like he'd counted it twice to make sure he wasn't being generous. I remember the sound it made, that small, dry slap of paper on Formica, more than I remember his face. I've spent 6 years trying to remember his face in that moment, and I can't. I remember the money. I remember the sound. I remember the particular gray of the sky outside the kitchen window, the kind of flat Ohio gray that doesn't commit to rain or sun, just sits there all day like it can't be bothered to decide. "That's for gas and whatever," he said. "You'll figure it out, Dad. You always figure it out." He stood in my kitchen in a gray peacoat that cost more than my truck payment, holding a folder of papers I'd signed 2 weeks before because he told me the store needed restructuring, that I was going to lose everything to the bank if I didn't let him handle the financial side, that he had a friend at a firm in Columbus who could set it up clean. I trusted him because he was my son, and because grief does something to a man's judgment that nobody warns you about, grief over a wife long gone, grief over a store that couldn't compete with the box store off the interstate, grief I didn't even know I was carrying until it was already spent. By the time I understood what I'd signed, the savings account I'd built nickel by nickel over 4 decades was down to $9 and change. The store was in his name. The house, mortgaged again without my knowing how, was in his name too, for tax purposes, he said. And now here he was in my kitchen, on his way out the door to a rented U-Haul with Ohio plates about to become Arizona plates, laying $300 on the table like a settlement. "You'll figure it out," he said again, because I hadn't spoken. "I want to tell you I said something biblical. Something a father is supposed to say in that moment. How could you? Or I gave you everything, or get out and don't come back." I didn't say any of that. I said, "Drive safe." That's what came out of me. 41 years of work standing in $300 on a table, and what my mouth produced was "drive safe," because some old part of me was still trying to be his father even while he was finishing the job of unmaking me as one. He didn't hug me. He didn't look back at the house he grew up in, at the porch light I'd replaced 4 separate times over 20 years, at the mailbox with our name stenciled on it in paint I'd touched up every spring since he was still in diapers. He just picked up the last box, said something about traffic on a -70 if he didn't beat the afternoon rush, and walked out into a Tuesday that looked, from where I stood, exactly like every other Tuesday of my life. Same flat light, same crack in the driveway I kept meaning to patch, except that it wasn't, because everything after that Tuesday would be measured against it. The way people measure their lives from a war, a funeral, or a diagnosis. There was a moment just before he reached the door when he paused with his hand on the frame, and for half a second I thought something in him might crack some old flicker of the boy who used to run to me in the store aisles when he skinned a knee, who used to fall asleep against my shoulder on long drives no matter how many times I told him to buckle in properly first. It didn't crack. He just adjusted his grip on the box, said, "I'll text you when I land," and I understood even then that land meant somewhere entirely outside the reach of anything I could still call home. I stood at the window and watched the U-Haul back out too fast, clip the mailbox post hard enough to knock it crooked, and keep going without slowing. I didn't go out and check the damage. I stood there a long time after the sound of the engine disappeared down Route 9, in a kitchen that no longer legally belonged to me, in a life I no longer fully recognized, holding $300 in my hand like it was evidence I'd have to explain to somebody someday. The strange thing, the thing I still can't get past, all these years later, is that some part of me was proud of him in that exact moment, proud of how clean he'd made it, how efficient. I'd raised a boy who could walk into a room, dismantle his own father's life, and leave without raising his voice once. I used to think that kind of composure was a virtue. I taught it to him myself without meaning to. Every time I told him a man doesn't let people see him rattled. I just never imagined I'd be the one he practiced it on. I should tell you who I am, because a story like this means nothing if you can't picture the man it happened to. My name is Walter Hale. I was 62 years old the day my son Daniel put that money on my table, though I'm 68 now, writing this down for the first time, and the 6 years between those two ages feel less like time passing and more like a held breath I'm only now letting out. I was born in Zanesville, Ohio, raised in a house with no indoor plumbing until I was 11, and I've lived within 40 miles of that house my entire life, except for 2 years in the Army that I'll get to. I am not by any measure a bank would recognize an extraordinary man. I finished high school and no more. I worked with my hands my whole life, first unloading delivery trucks for a hardware store on 5th and Lowell for $3.10 an hour, then behind the counter of that same store. Then eventually as its owner, when old man Bricker's knees finally gave out on him, and he needed someone he trusted to take it over more than he needed top dollar for it. I raised a son alone from the time he was 9 years old, after his mother, Renee, left for a man who sold pontoon boats out of a lot in Sarasota and never once called on a birthday in the 17 years that followed. I want to say I raised Daniel well. I believed that, for a long time, the way you believe things you've built your whole identity around the same way a carpenter believes his houses stand straight even after he's stopped checking them with a level. I worked 31 years at that hardware store and another 11 as its owner, and every dollar that moved through that register got split, in my head if nowhere else. Between the mortgage and Daniel's braces and Daniel's baseball cleats and Daniel's car and Daniel's tuition at a college he left after 4 semesters because, he told me, real estate was where the money actually was now, Dad. Not retail, he wasn't wrong about that as it turned out. Just not in the way either of us pictured it at the time. I tell you all this, my name, my age, the shape of my life before that Tuesday, because I think it matters that you understand I wasn't a fool in any ordinary sense. I wasn't careless with money. I wasn't naive about people in general. 40 years of running a small-town hardware store teaches you plenty about which customers will pay you back and which ones you should stop extending credit to after the second missed payment. I was careful is the truth of it. Careful my whole life, right up until the one person I never thought to be careful around was standing across my own kitchen table with a folder of papers and a voice so calm it never once occurred to me to be afraid. He left conditions, though. That's the part people don't believe when I tell it because it sounds too plain, too much like something scripted for a courtroom. But betrayal, when it's carried out by someone who loves you, is almost always administrative. It comes with terms. Daniel had his written out, not on paper. He wasn't foolish enough to leave a record, but spoken, flat, like he was reading them off the back of a phone. He kept glancing down at while the U-Haul idled in the driveway behind him. 1, I would not contact him unless it was an emergency, and he alone would decide what qualified as one. 2, I would not go to his mother's family, my ex-wife's people, and ask them for money or tell them what had happened between us because it would make things messy for him professionally in whatever new life he was driving toward. 3, I would vacate the house within 30 days since it was legally his now and he intended to sell it. He'd try, he said, to give me a portion of whatever it went for, though I remember there was no try anywhere in his eyes when he said the word, only the flat certainty of a man closing a transaction. 4, I would not speak to his son, my own grandson, Cole, 6 years old at the time, about any of what had happened between his father and me, ever, because children didn't need to carry adult weight, he said, as though weight were something a person could simply decide, by force of will, not to hand down to the next generation. And a 5th condition, though he never said it aloud, when I felt settle into the room the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before a storm arrives. I would not matter to him again unless, someday, I became useful to him again. That was the whole deal. That was the entire architecture of how a son can take his father apart, piece by legal piece, and still walk away believing, I think he genuinely believed it, that what he'd done was almost reasonable, almost kind, a hard decision made by a practical man rather than a betrayal made by a son. I have turned those 5 conditions over in my mind more times than I can count in 6 years, and what strikes me most even now isn't their cruelty, it's their order. Money first, silence second, the house third. The grandchild fourth, and me last of all, filed away like a contract clause nobody expects to ever need. People want to know how a man survives that. I didn't survive it with any dignity, if that's what they're picturing when they ask. I survived it the way most people survive most things, badly, and slowly, and in a way that looks from the outside a great deal like giving up. I moved into a single room above what used to be my own hardware store, a room I'd once used for extra inventory, with a hot plate and a mattress I bought second-hand off a church bulletin board for $40. Daniel sold the store itself within 4 months to a regional chain that gutted it and turned it into a vape shop and a nail salon sharing one address, the old Bricker hardware sign taken down and thrown, I later heard, into a dumpster behind the building. 31 years of my life and old man Bricker's whole working life before that, hauled off with the drywall scraps. I took a job stocking shelves at the very box store off the interstate that had put me out of business in the first place, because pride, I learned fast, is a luxury item, and I was no longer a man who could afford luxury items. I was 62 years old, unloading pallets at 5 in the morning next to 19-year-olds who called me, sir, out of some instinct their mothers had drilled into them, and I was grateful for every shift, because the alternative was silence in a room with a hot plate and nobody in the world expecting me anywhere. The town knew, of course, towns always know. Ellery Trask, who'd bagged my groceries for years back when I still had a house to bring groceries to, stopped meeting my eyes at the register. Not out of unkindness, I want to be fair about that, even now, but because he didn't know what to do with his face when he looked at a man everyone had once called one of the good ones, now counting out change for the store brand bread that was 2 days from its sell-by date. Worse than pity was the blame. My sister Carol, who'd never much cared for how I raised Daniel alone and always believed a boy needed a mother in the house more than I liked to admit, told people at her church that I must have driven him to it somehow. "There's always two sides," she'd say, not to my face, because Carol never said much of anything to my face. But it got back to me, the way things always get back to a man in a town small enough that everyone's business becomes everyone's business by Thursday. My own brother-in-law asked me once, not unkindly, but not kindly either, what I'd done to make a boy do a thing like that to his own father. As if betrayal were a debt collected rather than a debt manufactured out of nothing. As if I owed the whole county an explanation for the exact shape of the wound I was carrying around with me. I stopped going to the diner on Sundays, where I used to sit at the counter with 2 eggs and black coffee and talk to whoever else was sitting there about nothing in particular. I stopped answering the phone unless I recognized the number, and even then only sometimes, because most of what came through in those years was collection agencies asking about a mortgage I no longer had any legal stake in but had apparently co-signed for at some point I couldn't fully reconstruct, back when Daniel still called it just a formality. Dad, trust me. I learned to live small. I learned that a man can eat the same 6 meals on rotation for the better part of a decade and eventually stop noticing the taste of any of them. I learned that shame has an actual temperature, and it runs colder than anything Ohio ever produced in the dead of January. There was a particular Tuesday, almost a year to the day after Daniel left, when I stood in the box store's break room eating a sandwich alone at a folding table, and one of the younger stalkers, a kid named Marcus, maybe 20, asked me, not unkindly, if I had kids of my own. I told him no, it came out of me before I could stop it, and I've never fully understood why. Maybe because the truth required more explaining than I had strength for that particular afternoon. Maybe because, in some way I'm not proud of, it was already starting to feel more true than the actual truth. There was a woman at the box store, a cashier named Dottie who'd worked retail her whole life and had a way of reading a person's face before they'd said a word, who used to slide an extra discount through the register for me on certain items without ever mentioning it. The way you'd quietly feed a stray without letting on you'd noticed it was hungry. I never told her why I needed it, she never asked. There's a particular kind of decency in people who choose not to ask, and I met more of it in that break room over those years than I ever expected to, which is its own strange comfort that even while half a town was busy deciding whose fault my ruin was, another quiet half of it was simply trying to make the ruin a little more bearable without saying so out loud. I want to be honest about the parts of me that weren't decent during that stretch too, because it would be too easy, sitting here writing this now, to make myself sound like a man who suffered nobly and said nothing unkind. That isn't true. I said plenty unkind, mostly to myself, alone in that room above the old store, some nights out loud, the way a man does when he's certain nobody's close enough to hear him. I called myself things I wouldn't repeat to Josephine even now. I blamed Renee for leaving in the first place, decades after the fact, as though her leaving had somehow planted the seed in Daniel that made all this possible, which isn't fair to her and never was. I blamed myself for every soft moment I ever gave that boy, every time I let him talk his way out of a consequence, as though tenderness itself were the crime rather than what got done with it later. What nobody in that town knew, not Carol, not Ellery Trask, not the bank, and God knows not Daniel, wherever he was by then, 3 states and a whole new life away, was that I wasn't actually broke. I hadn't been broke, not in the way that mattered most, for 37 years. I need to go back further to explain this part, because otherwise none of it makes sense, and I don't want it landing like some twist I've pulled out of my pocket for effect. It isn't a twist, it's a wound of its own, an older one, quieter, one I never showed a single soul, not even my first wife across 18 years of marriage, not even Daniel in the 26 years I raised him. In 1987, I served 2 years alongside a man named Earl Doss, stationed together out of Fort Knox, a quiet man from western Nebraska who talked more about soil composition and winter wheat than about anything the Army particularly wanted us thinking about. Earl's family had land, not much by Nebraska standards, 60 acres of scrub along a 2-lane county road outside a town called Ashby that had maybe 400 people in it on a good year, and when his father died and left it to him, Earl didn't want any part of it. Said the flatness of it made him feel buried alive even while standing straight up in the middle of it. He offered to sell me his half-interest, 40 acres, for $1,100, mostly because I was the only man in our unit who'd ever actually saved money instead of drinking or gambling it away by the 15th of every month. I bought it, I never told a soul. Not because I was scheming anything, I want to be honest about that, there was no scheme in it, not at the start, but because a young man from a poor family who suddenly owns 40 acres of land, even worthless land, learns quickly that people's whole relationship to him changes the second they catch wind he has something. My own father had owned a small piece of land once near Zanesville, and I watched cousins and so-called friends circle it like it was a wounded animal the moment word got out. I watched what that circling did to him, the asking, the borrowing, the slow curdling resentment whenever he finally said no to somebody. I was 19 when they talked him into selling it cheap to a friend who flipped it 8 months later for nearly 4 times what he paid. I decided then quietly, the way a young man decides things without ever once saying them out loud to another living person, that if I ever came to own anything of my own, I would keep my mouth shut about it for exactly as long as I had breath in me. So I did. 40 acres of Nebraska scrub grass sat quietly in my name for 37 years, and I paid the property taxes on it faithfully every single year. Sometimes it was $15, sometimes closer to 40, depending on the county's mood out of whatever I had. Even in the years I had almost nothing at all, because that plot of land was the one thing in my entire life that no folder of papers, no smooth-talking son with a friend at a firm in Columbus could quietly sign away from me while my back was turned. Earl and I stayed loose friends after the Army, Christmas cards mostly, a phone call maybe twice a year, until he passed in 2011 of a heart attack in his own driveway, shoveling snow he'd shoveled 1,000 times before. His nephew, a young man named Grant, inherited the other half of that land, and having better instincts than most young men his age, put a small oil and gas lease on it in 2015, when drilling activity crept south out of the Bakken Formation into that corner of the state. He called me the way you'd call a business partner, because that's what I technically was by then, and asked whether I wanted in on the lease too. I said yes, quietly, the way I'd handled everything connected to that land since 1987. It didn't make me rich, not in the way people picture the word when they hear it used about a man like me. But it made me solvent in a slow and unglamorous way, a few $100s a month at first, wired into an account Daniel never once knew existed, and then more as the lease terms shifted, and then, in 2021, a company looking to expand its footprint offered a lump sum for additional mineral rights on the parcel that, after the lawyer Grant insisted I finally hire, put more money into an account under my own name than I had ever seen gathered in one place across my entire life. I still stocked shelves at the box store for 2 more years after that transaction cleared. I didn't yet know how to stop being the man who needed to. I think about that sometimes, how a man can sit on real money and still show up at 5 in the morning to unload pallets beside teenagers, not because he needs the paycheck but because he's forgotten, or maybe never learned, how to be a person who doesn't need to prove something to an empty room every single day. Money didn't undo 6 years of humiliation. It just meant the humiliation for the first time had somewhere private to rest. I drove out to Ashby once in the fall of 2022, alone, telling Teresa only that I had some old Army business to settle. I hadn't seen that land with my own eyes since 1989. It's nothing to look at, still flat and gold brown that time of year, a single pump jack turning slow and patient near the northeast corner, a fence line Grant had strung tight and true. I stood at the edge of it for the better part of an hour, hands in my coat pockets, and I thought about my father's land near Zanesville, sold off cheap to a man who called himself a friend. And I thought about how strange it was that the same instinct that cost my father everything, the instinct to trust a man who used the word friend a little too easily, was the exact instinct I'd spent my whole adult life training myself out of. One silence at a time, one Christmas card instead of a phone call at a time, until secrecy itself became the only inheritance I trusted enough to keep. I didn't feel triumphant standing there. I want to be clear about that, because it would make for a tidier story if I had. I mostly just felt tired, and a little sad for the boy I'd been in 1987, a boy so certain that the only way to protect anything good in his life was to make sure nobody else ever knew it existed. The second thing I never told a soul is harder to write down than the money, because money is only ever numbers, and this isn't. Her name is Teresa. I met her in 2016 at a laundromat 2 towns over from Ellery, on an ordinary Tuesday, because the dryer in the room above the old hardware store had finally died, and I didn't have the money yet to fix it. She was folding a child's clothes when I walked in, not her own child, her sister's. She was watching him for the week, and she made some dry, half-muttered comment about the industrial detergent smell that made me laugh out loud for what felt like the first genuine time in 3 years. She was 51, divorced once, no children of her own yet, and not looking, she told me much later, for a man who came attached to a story, because every man she'd met past 50 came attached to some story or another, and most of those stories, in her experience, were either boring or self-pitying, sometimes both at once. I didn't tell her mine, not for a long while. I told her I had a son somewhere out west we weren't close with, which was true in the driest, most narrowly technical sense a sentence can be true. I didn't tell her about the store, or the $300, or the land in Nebraska, or any of it, because for the first time in years I had found something in my life that had nothing whatsoever to do with what had been done to me. And I was terrified, genuinely, physically terrified, in a way that used to wake me up at night, that if I let Daniel's shadow anywhere near that laundromat, it would follow us the way it had followed everything else I'd tried to rebuild. We took things slow. We didn't marry until 2018, small at the courthouse, 4 people as witnesses, a lunch afterward at a diner where nobody but us knew it was our wedding day. In 2019, our daughter was born. We named her Josephine after Teresa's grandmother, and I held her in the hospital room under those flat fluorescent lights and felt something crack open in my chest that I hadn't known was still sealed shut after everything. Not joy exactly. Joy feels too small a word for it. More like the particular grief of realizing you're still capable of doing something over again, more gently, that you did roughly the first time around, and that the softness required for it had been in me the whole time. Just buried under 30-some years of trying to be the kind of man other men couldn't take advantage of. I am careful with Josephine in a way I don't believe I ever fully knew how to be careful with Daniel. I tell her no, and I mean it when I say it, and I also tell her why every single time, because I've learned somewhere along the way that a child who understands the why behind a boundary grows into an adult who doesn't need to test that boundary just to feel its edges. I don't work 60-hour weeks and call it love, the way I did with Daniel, telling myself all that overtime was somehow for him when in truth, if I'm honest with myself now in a way I couldn't be back then, some real portion of it was for the quiet the empty house gave me when nobody in it needed anything from me at all. I sit cross-legged on the floor with Josephine most evenings and build block towers I have no attachment to seeing knocked down. I have never once, not a single time across 6 years, called her by the wrong name out of pure exhaustion, though God knows there have been nights I was tired enough that it would have been an easy mistake to make. There's a particular evening I keep coming back to, maybe a year into knowing her, before we'd even talked about marriage, when Teresa asked me, out of nowhere, over dinner at her kitchen table, why I flinched every time she mentioned inheritance or property or anything to do with money passed between family members. I hadn't realized I flinched until she named it. I told her that night more of the truth than I'd told anyone in years, not everything, not the number, not even Daniel's name yet, but enough about watching my own father get talked out of his land. Enough about the particular shame of losing something slowly to people who called themselves family the whole time they were taking it. She didn't press for more than I offered. She just reached over and put her hand flat on top of mine on the table and said, "Nobody's going to talk you out of anything with me at the table, Walter." I believed her. I still believe her 6 years into a marriage where that promise has never once been tested because she's never once tried. Teresa doesn't know about the land, either not the full number of it, not the specifics. She knows we're comfortable, that there was a settlement of some kind tied to an old army investment, and she's never pushed past that answer, because Teresa is the rare kind of person who has never once looked at what I have and quietly wondered what she might get out of it. I think if I'm honest, that's the entire reason I fell in love with her in the first place, not the laundromat joke, not her face, though God knows I love her face too, but that specific, quiet absence of hunger in her. After Daniel, I didn't fully believe that absence still existed anywhere in people. I had started to believe, somewhere down in the part of me I don't examine too closely, that love and appetite were simply the same thing wearing 2 different names. Cole is 17 now. I know this because of what happened in March. I don't know Cole, not really. That's the plainest way I know how to say it. I've seen 4 photographs of him across his entire life, all of them sent years ago by my ex-wife's sister, who still speaks to me out of some old loyalty that outlasted the divorce even when almost nothing else did. I know he played baseball at some point, because one of the pictures showed him in a maroon uniform, squinting up into an Arizona sun that looked nothing at all like the sun I grew up under in Ohio. I know he has Daniel's exact jaw, and in one photograph, an expression around the eyes that resembled my own father's so closely, it stopped me cold at my kitchen table for a full minute the day it arrived in the mail. What I know about March, I know mostly because Daniel called me. 6 years and 4 months since the $300, and my phone lit up one afternoon with a number I still had saved, after all that time, under the name Danny rather than Daniel, because some stubborn old part of me apparently never got the memo about how much distance had grown between those 2 names. I didn't answer. I let it ring itself out on the kitchen counter while Josephine ate cereal across from me, swinging her feet under her chair, and Teresa read something on her phone beside the sink. And I watched the screen the way you'd watch a storm cloud you weren't yet sure was going to pass safely over the house or land directly on the roof. It rang out. 30 seconds later, a voicemail notification appeared, small and patient, waiting. I didn't listen to it that day. I want to be honest about that too, since this isn't a story where the wounded father rises immediately to grace the moment his son reaches back out. I sat with it a full 3 days before I let myself hear his voice again for the first time in over 6 years. What I eventually pieced together, partly from the voicemail itself and partly from Teresa's sister-in-law, who still has some thread of connection back into that side of my old life, was this. Cole, working on some school assignment about family history, one of those projects where kids get told to trace their roots, build a little tree, interview whoever's still around to interview, had gone digging one evening the way 17-year-olds with a laptop and a few free hours will do, and had come across property records. Nebraska property records, oil and gas lease filings, a name matching a grandfather he'd never once met but had heard mentioned exactly twice in his whole life, both times in that particular flattened, careful tone adults use for things they'd rather not explain any further than absolutely necessary. He'd shown his father what he found. Dad, did you know Grandpa owns land in Nebraska? Like actual mineral rights, there's a company website that lists him as a lessor on 4 separate filings. I picture that exact conversation more often than I probably should, turning it over at night the way you'd worry a loose tooth. I picture Daniel's face doing the arithmetic it always did too fast, the very same arithmetic that once turned a struggling father's hardware store into an opportunity, dressed up carefully as help. The voicemail itself, when I finally sat down and listened to it, didn't mention any of that directly. Daniel is smarter than that, or at least smoother than that. It was warm. It was, God help me, almost gentle. Hey Dad, it's me. I know it's been a long time. I think about you more than you probably know. Cole's getting so big he's asking about you, wants to know his grandpa. I'd love to talk whenever you're ready. No pressure. I love you. I sat in my truck in the box store parking lot afterward. I still work there, 3 days a week now, not because I need the income any longer, but because I've never fully learned how to stop being the man who needs somewhere to be at 5 in the morning, and I listened to that voicemail 4 separate times, and each time it left me feeling a slightly different kind of sick. The first time through, some old, stupid, loyal part of me that will apparently never fully die wanted to call him back inside the hour. The second time, I caught the seam running through it. Cole's asking about you is a sentence that does an enormous amount of quiet work, the work of dressing a man's own guilt up as his son's innocent yearning. The third time, I thought about that folder of papers I signed at my own kitchen table, believing at the time I was protecting my son's future, and how thin the line really is between a father's love and a father's exploitation once somebody decides, deliberately or not, to walk that particular line. The fourth time through, I just cried, sitting alone in a Ford pickup in a supermarket parking lot in Ohio, 68 years old, over a version of my son that only ever fully existed for the length of a childhood I gave him, and that he apparently doesn't remember costing me anything at all. Somewhere around the second week, I made the mistake of looking Daniel up online, which I hadn't let myself do in years. I found a real estate listing photo of him standing in front of a house in Scottsdale he'd apparently sold, arms crossed, smiling the exact smile he used to give customers at Bricker Hardware when he worked the register for me as a teenager, the smile that always meant he wanted something to go a certain way and had already decided it would. I found a picture of Cole too, tagged in someone else's post, taller than I'd have guessed, standing next to a truck that looked newer than any vehicle I'd owned in the last decade. I sat with that image a long time. I couldn't tell, looking at it, whether I was looking at a stranger or at the ghost of every hope I used to carry for a family I no longer had any real claim to. He's called 11 times since that first message in March. Some weeks it's once. One particularly bad week in May, it was 4 times in 5 days, like something in him had started to panic that the silence on my end meant a door closing for good rather than one still deciding whether to open. I've answered exactly 0 of those calls. Each unanswered ring cost me something I couldn't fully explain to Teresa even if I tried, and each one in its own way also gives something back, a small, hard-won proof to myself that I am, finally, after 68 years on this earth, capable of choosing my own silence instead of only ever absorbing whatever silence gets handed to me by somebody else. I think about what I owe Cole, separate and apart from what I don't believe I owe Daniel, and that distinction is the part of all this that still keeps me up some nights, more than the money ever did, more even than the years of shelf-stocking and store-brand bread and Carol's church whispers. Cole didn't do a single thing to me. Cole was 6 years old, forbidden even from being told the plainest version of the truth, and now he's 17 and curious in the exact healthy way a person that age ought to be curious about where they actually come from. And the pure accident of his timing, that his curiosity happened to surface the very same year the lease numbers went public, doesn't make his wanting a grandfather in his life any less real or any less his own. Children inherit consequences they never once voted for. I know that better than almost anyone alive, because I spent 31 years of my working life trying to build a wall high enough that Daniel would never have to learn that particular lesson the hard way. Teresa asked me once gently, the way she asks nearly everything, whether I intended to call him back. We were sitting out on the porch, Josephine already down for the night, on the kind of early summer Ohio evening where the heat finally breaks around 8 o'clock, and the whole yard fills up with the smell of freshly cut grass, and somebody 2 houses down grilling out on their charcoal. I don't know, I told her, which was the truest answer I had available to me. I don't know if I'm protecting myself at this point, or if I'm just still punishing him. Some days I honestly can't tell those 2 things apart anymore. Maybe they don't have to be different things, she said, not looking up right away from whatever she was doing with her hands. Maybe you're allowed both at once. I've turned that sentence over more times than I could possibly count since that evening. I don't believe, not anymore, that forgiveness and self-protection are supposed to stand as enemies of one another. Though for years I built my entire life around treating them exactly that way, as though softening toward Daniel even by an inch would somehow mean the $300 never happened, would mean I'd imagined the folder of papers, would mean Carol's church whispers had been right about me all along, and I really had done something, somewhere, to earn all of it. I understand now slowly that none of that is true. A man can hold a real wound in one hand and a real door in the other at the very same time. He simply has to decide in his own time and nobody else's which one he's finally ready to walk through first. Some nights I imagine calling him back just to ask one question, the only one that actually matters to me anymore, more than an apology, more than an explanation of the folder of papers or the mortgage or any of it. Whether he ever thinks about that mailbox he clipped on his way out, crooked for 11 months before I finally had the money to fix it myself. Whether some small, ordinary detail like that has ever once crossed his mind in 6 years, the way it crosses mine more often than I'd like to admit, or whether the whole afternoon simply evaporated for him the moment he hit the interstate, filed away under things that had to be done to get where he was going. I haven't called Daniel back, not yet, and maybe not for a long while still. But last week I sat down at my kitchen table and wrote Cole a letter the old-fashioned kind, actual pen on actual paper, because I didn't trust myself not to say either too much or too little in a text message he could reread and pick apart at 2 in the morning the way teenagers do with everything. I told him about Earl Doss and the laundromat and Josephine, the aunt he's never once met, 4 years old now and already stubborn as a mule about which shoes she'll agree to wear out the door. I told him I would love to know him, on my own terms and in my own time, entirely separate from whatever complicated thing his father is currently trying to work out with me. I told him none of what happened between me and his father was ever, in any measure, his fault, and that a person is fully capable of loving a family member while still needing real years to rebuild any trust in them, and that both of those things being true at the exact same time doesn't make him disloyal for wanting to know his own grandfather regardless. I haven't mailed it yet. It's sitting on the kitchen table, the same table. If you can believe that particular detail, I bought it back myself at an estate sale 2 years after everything originally fell apart. The same scarred oak table from the house Daniel sold out from under me without so much as a phone call to explain it. Some strange coincidence, or maybe it isn't a coincidence at all. Maybe it's just a small enough town quietly circling its own old furniture back around to the very people who once lost it. $300 sat on that table once, folded and counted twice like a stranger settling a debt. A letter sits on it now, unsealed, unsent, waiting on nothing but my own nerve. I don't know yet what either one of them is truly worth or ever will be. I only know that I'm the one who finally gets to decide, this time around, on my own schedule, in my own house, with my own name on the deed, and that alone, after absolutely everything, feels like something very close to enough.